All right, welcome to my full review of the DJI FPV drone, as well as a guide for if you're thinking of making the switch from the Mavic series. Let's check this thing out. All right, so before we get into this full review, we've got to talk a little bit about FPV. There is a ton of information out there in the world about FPV drones, but there's also a lot of confusion. So let's just get through some of the basics before we get into this. All right, so first, maybe a little bit obvious, but in the world of FPV, the pilot's actually taking a first-person view of the drone and what the drone actually sees, and they're usually wearing a headset, not unlike this one where you've got a crystal clear, beautiful view of the world. Now second, in full FPV mode, this drone is doing no self-correcting. Just remember back to when you had your Mavic and that first time you flew it up and it was a little bit windy and you just watched as that drone just stayed perfectly stable and kind of corrected itself with the wind and didn't go anywhere. Now in full FPV mode, the DJI FPV and all the other FPV drones have absolutely no interest in this little card trick. And finally, most FPV drones are actually built from the ground up, either by yourself or by someone else. They usually have a transmitter, they've got a control unit, they've got rotors, they usually have two cameras and batteries. One is to transmit and the other one is to actually capture the image that you want for your videos. So what DJI has really done here is they've just combined all of this into one simple, easy to fly package. They've taken a lot of the safety and usability features of the Mavic and they brought it into the FPV world. But the question is this thing actually any good? All right, so let's start first with the setup. Now, if you've owned any of the DJI drones in the Mavic series, you kind of are familiar with this crazy process for getting everything paired and actually updating firmware. If you were frustrated by that experience, buckle up because you are going to hate the experience with this FPV drone. I just had countless problems with this. I couldn't get it paired to start, couldn't get the firmware updated. Found out after that the reason for it was that it wasn't at 100% battery. Eventually I did get the whole thing up to date, really smooth sailing from there. So once you've got this DJI FPV drone set up, how do you ease yourself into the world of FPV drone flying? So most traditional pilots in the FPV world start pretty small. They usually get a very lightweight, low-cost drone and practice flying, and there's very low risk. If you crash it, there's really nothing gonna happen. Luckily, DJI does provide an amazing simulator that's based on the iPhone or Android that you can use to practice your flying before you head out into the real world. Now, if you haven't purchased the FPV drone yet, it's a free download. The only difference is you're kind of restricted to only flying in that traditional Mavic mode. It gives you a chance to fly the drone in manual, learn how to control it, go through a few obstacle courses until you get used to it enough to try it out there with your actual drone. So what the hell is FPV flying anyway? I mean, we've probably all seen these amazing footage of someone flying through a bowling alley or flying through an abandoned building, doing flips, and you kind of think to yourself, like, how much different could this actually be than flying the Mavic? It's different. Here's actually how this works. When you're using a drone in the Mavic series, the drone is actually translating the inputs that you're putting into the controller into a literal translation of what you want the drone to do. When you press up on the left stick on a Mavic, it's gonna just go up in altitude. As you push forward on the right stick, the drone actually starts to tilt, but DJI is actually doing some real intelligence here. They're applying the thrust to make sure that the elevation doesn't go up or down, and then they're actually rotating this gimbal to make sure that the actual camera stays perfectly level in the frame. So even though the drone is tilted this way and going forward, your impression is that the drone is nice and stable and just flying in a straight line. And then as you press that right stick to the right or the left to bank, it's actually doing the same thing. It's making sure that you're keeping a nice level horizon so that the gimbal's actually turning. And it's keeping the yaw perfectly balanced so that this drone doesn't start to tilt down this way or tilt up this way. Everything is just nice and stable. It's doing all this work for you. What this little drone does is it says, all that. If you want to push that controller to the left or the right in full manual mode, it's literally just going to flip over. There's no control, there's no safeguards. In full manual mode, you are completely on your own. If learning to fly the Mavic series takes a little bit of courage and a little bit of patience, learning to fly the FPV takes a whole lot of insanity. I probably spent 8 to 10 hours just in the simulator with the headset in full manual mode, crashing and crashing and crashing and crashing until I felt like I had enough hang of the controls that I actually could get out into the world and fly this drone in full manual. Don't mind how ridiculous I look, but I'm out here in one of our public land use areas in Alberta. It's one of the few places that you can legally fly a drone. I'm a little nervous, but let's go and see how it goes.
Well, when you feel it can get worse, it's like every day just gets more gray. I gotta wait for it, wait for it. Well, when the truth begins to hurt, know that everyone gonna see the sun. You gotta wait for it, wait for it.
All right, so let's talk about controls. Now, the controller, I feel, is just, it feels like an upgrade all around when you hold this thing in your hand compared to the old Mavic 2 Pro controller. I mean, this thing starts to feel like a bit of a toy. You know, all the indicators that are typically on here have moved into the headset, and all you're really left with is a simple, sleek, and really well-built design. That brings us back to this, the FPV headset. Now, you could technically fly an FPV drone just using the screen on your phone or on a separate monitor, but for FPV flying, you really need a few things. You need a very low latency signal. You have to be able to see exactly where the drone is and what it's doing in real time. And you need a high definition screen, and you need that screen to be easy to see, no sunlight, no flare. One thing that's a little jarring at first if you've never flown FPV is there's no real stabilization here until the image is processed. So with a lot of the GoPro based FPVs, there's a suite of software that will actually add the stabilization after. Now DJI does this directly to the files that it writes to the SD card in the drone. So when you put this on your laptop, it is pre-stabilized, which is great. But when you're flying, that stabilization's gone, so you're gonna really find it a little bit jarring how quickly the camera moves and how it doesn't feel very stable. Now, if you're coming over from one of the Mavic drones, and most specifically the Mavic Pro 2, you're gonna notice a pretty significant drop off in the image quality. Yes, the DJI FPV is 4K 60, it can shoot 120 frames per second in slow motion, it's got some flat profiles, and for all intents and purposes, it should be an incredible camera. But there's just a bit of a difference. First of all, the sensor in this drone isn't quite as big as the one in the Mavic Pro 2. Gimbal isn't actually a 4-axis stabilization. You're losing a bit of quality when it has to stabilize this footage after it shoots it. This actual drone doesn't shoot in D-Log, which is DJI's log profile, a very flat image that can be processed later on and color graded. It's also not 10-bit color, so there's not as much room there to color grade. It's a good camera, but it's not a great camera. I guess this begs the question, if the camera is not as good as the Mavic and the controls are almost impossible, like, why would you switch? This is why you switch. Your heart rate when flying this drone is crazy. You put a heart rate monitor on me. The terror of being so close to the trees and every little movement. Well, if the Mavic series is like a Tesla that you use to impress your friends, the DJI FPV is like a manual transmission, rear-wheel drive, overpowered, understeered, no suspension Porsche 911 with a turbo. In other words, it's a hell of a lot of fun. So you remember that feeling you got the first time you flew your Mavic and you're looking at your local park, your hometown through that little 5-inch screen? Well, that is nothing compared to the feeling of flying at 144 kilometers per hour with a high definition screen in front of your face. You're feeling every turn and tilt. It is a complete game changer and like nothing that I've ever experienced flying drones. We get caught up in the video specs, we get caught up in the features, but that's the feeling we're looking for. And this drone with the headset and that first-person view, I mean, it's just an incredible feeling. At the end of the day, there's a lot better picture quality on the Mavic. And there's no limit to the advantages that you can find from building something yourself. But with this drone and all of the safety features that are built in and the integration between the headset and the controller and the drone, I mean, this is really the most accessible way to make the leap into the world of FPV. The community will be waiting for you, ready to give you tips, ready to give you advice, and probably ready to make fun of you a little bit when you crash the drone. All right, thanks everyone for watching. I've got a couple more videos coming on the DJI FPV, including an entire video on this little guy right here. This is the new smart controller. We're gonna be really refocusing this channel. I wanna really get back to shooting more cinematic videos. I wanna focus on tech reviews and products and maybe a little bit of van life built in. Please like and subscribe, and if you have any questions about the DJI FPV drone or FPV in general, please leave me a comment. And until the next one, we'll see you guys soon.